Welcome to Radical Engagement here at Varn Blog. And while I'm tempted to call this episode Graeber Haters, I'm not going to do that. My point today is a little bit more mendacious than that. I am reading a review by Professor of Anthropology Chris Knight, a guy who has written extensively on Graeber and on Chomsky, and I hope to have him on my show about Chomsky eventually. We're trying to set that up now. And we're going to go into his review from December 2021 of The Dawn of Everything, a book that got a ton of popular press and then lost a ton of popular press, and a book that I have soured on more and more the longer I sat with it. I am unpopular in that I think Graeber's biggest two books, the two that are most cited, The Dawn of Everything and Debt, are wildly inconsistent works. This is not to say I hate everything Graeber's ever written. There are some things I really like, but I have been harsh on Graeber for a long time. I argued with him about his understanding of Chinese history and debt when he was still alive, on my blog many years ago. So, and I've read Chris Knight talk about Graeber a little bit before on this very subject, but this is specifically his review of The Dawn of Everything. Wrong about almost everything. A review article on Dawn of Everything: A New History of Humanity by David Graeber and David Wengrow, Allen Lane, 2021. Let's begin with Chris Knight here. The Dawn of Everything's central idea is challenging. We are told that humans are politically adventurous and experimental, so much so that after a spell of freedom and equality, people are inclined to choose oppression just to make a change. History makes a rhythmic form, oscillating between one extreme and the next. In recent times, however, we've all gotten stuck in just one system, and we must try to understand why. All this is new and refreshing, but hardly credible. I would argue some of it's not even new. A lot of the sources that Graeber uses, sometimes representing them accurately, sometimes I feel less so, or from the 70s to the 90s, not really the cutting edge of research. I prefer the standard anthropological view that the political instincts and social emotions that define our humanity were shaped under conditions of egalitarianism. To this day, all of us feel most relaxed and happy when we're able to laugh and play and socialize among companions that are our equals. But instead of building on this experience so familiar to us, Graeber and Wengrow, henceforth G and W, oppose the whole idea that our hunter-gatherer ancestors were egalitarians. Asterisk. They barely acknowledge the existence of hunter-gatherers as a category. In their view, they would have just as likely to have chosen to be oppressed. I'm not sure that's entirely fair for the book, but it is actually an implication of the voluntarism in the book. As they put it, if the very essence of our humanity consists of the fact that we are self-conscious political actors and therefore capable of embracing a wide range of social arrangements, would that not mean human beings should actually have explored a wide range of social arrangements over the greater part of our history? And among these possibilities, as the authors readily acknowledge, were abusive dominance hierarchies like those of chimpanzees. G and W seem to be arguing that if our ancestors were so adventurous, then surely they would have experimented not only with egalitarianism, but also with harassment, abuse, domination by aggressive bullying males. G and W make these points in the context of a consistent attack on any idea that we become socially and morally human during the course of a revolution. All my academic life, I have been exploring the idea that human language, consciousness, kinship, and morality evolved in the process of gradual evolution, which culminated in an immense social and political revolution. My motivation was always to challenge the popular prejudice that socialism is impossible because by nature we humans are selfish and competitive. And quote, not even a revolution could change human nature. I would always answer this way. Yes, we are a species of great apes. Yes, like our primate cousins, we are competitive, selfish, aggressive, and often have violent instincts. But these were not the only one. But these were not the only ones responsible for our success. Everything distinctively human about our nature, our capacity to be brilliant moms and dads, to care for another's children, and not just our own, to establish moral rules, to see ourselves as others see us, and to use music, dance, and language to share our dreams. These extraordinary capacities were precisely the products of the greatest revolution in human history, the one that worked. Chris Bohm's theory of human revolution. Nearly a decade after the appearance of my own book detailing the complexities of this human revolution, Night, 1991, the anthropologist Christopher Bohm, 1999, published a version of the theory that, despite its insights, played safe in political terms by omitting any mention of the most important element, the dynamics of sex and gender. It is an abstract, unisex version of human revolution theory that G&W considers safe enough to mention explicitly in order to discredit it. Bohm points out that our earliest ancestors were neither one-sidedly cooperative nor one-sidedly competitive. Instead, they were from a psychologically disposed to dominate others while forming alliances to resist being dominated in turn. The collective resistance from below eventually culminated in everyone coming together to prevent any would-be leader from dominating the group. Our ancestors' chimpanzee-style dominance was turned on its head, culminating in reverse dominance, rule by morally aware community committed in an egalitarian ethos. G&W go along with the idea that humans do not appear to have begun with a self-conscious aversion to being told what to do. Do appear to have begun with a self-conscious aversion of being told what to do. In this context, they agree that extant hunter-gatherers display a whole panoply of tactics collectively employed to bring would-be braggarts and bullies down to earth, ridicule, shame, shunning, none of which have any parallel amongst other primates. What they've got no interest in is the idea that these tactics played a crucial role in shaping human nature during our evolutionary past. Yeah, there's a avoidance of evolution actually in Graeber and Wengrow that's a little bit worrying. One also sees it slightly in Marshall Solomons. Summing up their objection to Bohm's account, they describe any suggestion that hunter-gatherers consistently preferred egalitarianism as a, quote, odd insistence that, quote, for many tens of thousands of years, nothing happened. If our hunter-gatherer ancestors were consistently egalitarian, their political lives must have been somehow been frozen, stuck in time. G&W conclude with these words, quote, before about 12,000 years ago, Bohm insists humans were basically egalitarian. According to Bohm, for about 200,000 years, these political animals all chose to live just one way. The only problem with this isn't what Bohm wrote, and his words are actually worth quoting. Yeah, I want to say between this and what Daniel at What Is Politics caught Graeber doing, Graeber and Wengrow doing, one sees actually really irresponsible mischaracterizations of their sources that they're arguing with. Anyway, quote, once one band somewhere invented an egalitarian order, this radical change in the social ways of doing things would have become visible to its neighbors. The advantage would have been evident wherever subordinates were ambivalent about being dominated, particularly in bands with very aggressive bullies. One would expect a gradual culture diffusion to take place, with the attractive egalitarian traditions replacing despotic ones locally. Over time, migration patterns over long distance would have fairly rapidly spread the political invention from one continent to another. This is how successful revolutions work. Plainly, Bohm's argument was not simply that until 12,000 years ago, humans were basically egalitarian. Instead, what he suggests that human developed a variety of different political systems while gradually converging around one particularly successful model, egalitarianism. The tea time of everything. Quite unfairly, the dawn of everything conflates modern evolutionary theory with social evolutionism. Yeah, they do that a lot, and it really pisses me off. I think it's scientifically irresponsible. It's one of the big problems with the book, and Graeber does it all the time. It's not just in the Graeber and Wengrow book where you see this. The 19th century narrative of a ladder of stages progressing from savagery through barbarism to civilization. Darwinism claims to be scientific, we are told, but in reality is pure myth. Quixotically, G&W expect readers to give serious consideration to this perspective on human origins that does not acknowledge evolutionary theory at all. And people didn't even notice. Oh my God. It was so frustrating. The only science these authors do recognize is the archaeological science, and then only if the archaeology doesn't go too far back. They justify dating the dawn of everything to a mere 30,000 years ago on the basis of nothing about politics or social life that can be gleaned from the archaic human cranial remains and occasional pieces of Nat Flint. This excuse no longer works in light of recent evidence that our species' most unique trait, art and symbolic culture, emerged in Africa 3 to 4 times earlier than was previously thought. By no means limited to bones and stones, the evidence consists of beads, geometric engravings, burials with grave goods, and artifacts such as grindstones and paint pots, all inevitably found in association with red ochre. Henswood, 2009-2011. Yeah, this is another thing with the book. I actually was surprised how much recent anthropology in archaeology isn't in that book. G&W do notice that one or two of these discoveries, but show little interest, despite the fact that when the cutting-edge Darwinian theory is applied to the red ochre record, the possibilities for generating predictions about social dynamics, patterns of ritual performance, and gendered alliances become very real. See Powers, 2009-2019, Power et al., 2013, Power et al., 2021, Watts, 2014. Unfortunately, the doctors won't go near Darwinism in any shape or form. Yeah, they won't, and it's super fucking frustrating. And actually, they say Graeber says some things about comparing humans to primates that make it sound like that that to do any comparison of humans to primates is inherently racist, which is frankly anti-scientific. They concede that someone whom they term a feminist, factually the highly respected founding figure in primate and human social biology, Sarah Hardy, had come up with a story about the crucial role of collective childcare in shaping our human instincts and psychology. 2009, commenting that there's nothing wrong with myths, they describe this particular myth as important. They immediately cast down on it by quipping that such insights can only be partial because there's no Garden of Eden and a single Eve never existed. Yeah, but 6 mitochondrial lines of DNA that are identical do indicate that we have 6 primordial mothers, and we've known that for since we've figured out the genome. Tricks of this kind, in the case of ignoring the fact that Hardy's groundbreaking work is focused on the emergence of genus Homo some 2 million years before the dating of our common mitochondrial DNA ancestor, are clearly aimed at undermining the very idea that human origins research is worth pursuing at all. Yeah, it's like, I don't think people realize how scientifically irresponsible David Graeber was in that book, and Wengrow too. I don't know who wrote what, but Graeber has a history of that crap. Readers interested in the Mesolithic and Neolithic archaeology will find plenty of intriguing speculation in this book. But if you are interested in how we became human, how we developed our unusually revealing eyes, our extraordinary large brains, our distinctively social emotions, our laughter, our intimate capacity for music and language, you won't find anything at all. The title is seriously misleading. The Dawn of Everything, Tea Time would be more accurate. The story begins with the European Upper Paleolithic, best known for those spectacular cave paintings in the Ice Age France and Spain. According to the authors, but the stage of archaeology is at last getting interesting because it indicates the emergence of an economic surplus, allowing elites to arise. For the first time, we've begun to see evidence for social complexity, hierarchy, sumptuous burials, etc. Tiny hunter-gatherer bands. For G&W, the fact that our hunter-gatherer ancestors established an egalitarian lifestyle or much earlier in Africa is of limited interest. They concede that excellent hunter-gatherers such as the Hadza of Tanzania share their resources, but instead of admiring this, they complain that the resistance to accumulation obstructs the emergence of social complexity. Yeah, I wanted to throw Joseph Tainter at David Graeber's fucking head. Using this term where others might have spoken of class. Cough, cough. That's another thing I want to throw at their head. The authors, it seems, are averse to the concept of social class. So, hunter-gatherers obstruct complexity, i.e. prevent class society from arising by resisting the accumulation of wealth. G&W invoke the authority of hunter-gatherer specialist James Woodburn here. They conclude from his work that the only way to maintain a truly egalitarian society is to eliminate the possibility of accumulating any sort of surplus at all. This, they argue, rules out social complexity and with it, the full richness of human cultural and intellectual life. Asterisk. This seems like a weird crypto argument with anarcho-primitivists from the 90s, and given Graeber's a particular anarchist milieu, I wouldn't put it past it as what motivated that. Woodburn, 1982-2005, certainly did argue that deliberate resistance to accumulation underpins hunter-gatherer egalitarianism and represents a political choice consciously made. He observed that such egalitarianism was a feature only of non-storage hunter-gatherers, concluding that immediate return was the original type of human economy. But Woodburn did not argue that such egalitarianism was lacking in complexity. In fact, he viewed the binary contrast between simple and complex social forms as damaging and misleading. For Woodburn, maintaining egalitarianism was a supremely sophisticated achievement, demanding far greater levels of political intelligence and complexity than simply allowing inequities to arise. The Hadza, he explained, have the intelligence to realize how dangerous it would be to let anyone accumulate more wealth than they need. Wealth inequities are not okay. According to G&W, however, wealth inequities are unproblematic. In support of their position, they invoke Kandiaronk, the 17th century first American critic of European civilization, to whom they devote the inspiring chapter. Somewhat unconvincingly, they assure us that the Kandiaronk and his first American co-thinkers, quote, had trouble even imagining the difference of wealth could be translated into systemic inequities of power. G&W accept that immediate return hunter-gatherers refuse to allow wealth inequities to develop, but surprisingly, they regard this whole situation as disappointing. Quote, this might sound like the basis of something hopeful or optimistic. Actually, it is anything but. What it suggests is, again, that any equity worth its name is essentially impossible for our but the simplest forgers. What kind of future might we have in store? What kind of future? They answer this by suggesting that activists who take inspiration from the African hunter-gatherers are inviting modern-day city dwellers to become, quote, stuck, like the unfortunate Hadza, and repetitive simplicity of life in tiny nomadic bands. To be clear, I am no primitivist. I am in favor of technological, social, and political development. The Hadza illustrate that it is fulfilling and enjoyable to share wealth on demand, to laugh and sing, to waste time and play, to resist letting anyone dominate us, and to prioritize caring for each other's children over all other concerns. When it comes to development, these politically sophisticated bow and arrow hunters can teach us a lot. In the beginning, private property. G&W argue that private property is primordial because it is inseparable from religion. By way of illustration, they refer to the trumpets and other paraphernalia used in some indigenous traditions during boys' coming-of-age ceremonies. Quote, now these sacred items are, in many cases, the only important and exclusive forms of property that exist. It's not just relations of command that are strictly confined to sacred contexts, so too as absolute, are what we would today refer to as primitive property. In such societies, there turns out to be profound formal similarity between the notion of private property and the notion of the sacred. Both are essentially structures of exclusion. Note how absolute here gets translated as private. The claim seems to be that if ritual property is sacred to an absolute degree, then it qualifies by definition as private property. The conflation is to reinforce what authors seek authority for their associations of religion with private property. At this point, G and W invoke Emil Durkheim's classic definition of the sacred as that which gets set apart. Quote, Durkheim argued that the clearest expression of the sacred was the Polynesian term taboo, meaning not to be touched. But when we speak of the absolute private property, are we not talking about something very similar, almost identical in fact, in its underlying logic and social effects? The answer to that, my friends, is no. Anyway, the authors didn't describe how ethnographers working with indigenous Amazonians discovered that almost everything around them has an owner, or could potentially be owned, from the lakes to the mountains to the cultivars, to the linnea groves and animals. A spiritual entity's sacred ownership of the species or a resource set apart from the rest of the world. Similar reasoning, right? G&W underpins Western's conceptions of private property. If you own a car, they explain, you have the right to prevent anyone in the entire world from entering or using it. Except when you don't, when the police ask for it. But also, more importantly here, David Graeber, as early as his fragments of anarchist anthropology, has a very pronounced tendency to say X is Y because Y emerges from X. And it's really frustrating. Like, the state is a form of kinship is something he really floats as if they're just the same thing. And fragments of anarchist anthropology, he doesn't quite say that, but he comes very close to it. All right. When indigenous activists tell us that a lake or a mountain is sacred to a powerful spirit, are they not endorsing anything? They are not endorsing anything remotely equivalent to private property. If the Great Spirit owns the forest, a clear implication that it is not safe, not to be privatized, not to be claimed by a logging company. One of the most powerful of Durkheim's insight was that when people invoke divinity, they are envisioning the moral force of their community as a whole. So if a mountain belongs to God, that's a way of declaring that it cannot be privatized. When G&W turned that around, claiming that the concept of private property emerged inseparably from the very ideas that some things are sacred, you can see what a crude misrepresentation this is. Yep. Chris Knight, you're dead on. What Durkheim really said. For Durkheim, 1963-65, setting apart was the antithesis of private appropriation. In his quest to explain the origins of the worldwide cultural taboo against incest, he puzzled over the traditional beliefs investing women with, quote, with an isolating power of some sort, a power which holds the masculine population at a distance, 1965. In such, page 72, in such belief systems, Durkheim wrote, women's segregating power is that of their blood, bound up intimately with the notion of the sacred. If divinity becomes visible in the women when they bleed, it is because their blood itself is divine. When it runs out, the god is spilling over. Durkheim, 1965. For Durkheim, then, the primordial concept of setting apart had nothing to do with private property. The issue was what happened to a young woman on the coming of age. Alerted by the menstrual onset, her kin was assembled as a body to lay claim to her, that is, to initiate her, setting her apart from the male company and from the world. Her seclusion was accomplished through a special ritual, the coming of age ceremony. This established that her body was sacred, her choice with respect to it accountable to her sisters and her kin. In association with such collective actions, the emergence of human consciousness, language, and culture, for Durkheim, was the point at which a new kind of authority, that of the community, first came into being. If only G&W had shown an interest in modern evolutionary science, they would have recognized how these Durkheimian insights anticipated the most recent and authoritative modern archaeological explanation for the ochre record in human evolution, based on the idea that the blood red ochre was used by women as a cosmetic war paint to alert men to the newly established sacredness of the female body. Watts 2014, Power 2019, Power et al. 2021. Seasonal or lunar. Now we come to the dawn of everything's central idea. We were all at once free because we choose how to live, experimenting now with one's political structures and now another, sometimes even oscillating between utterly different social states. Anyone who has studied anthropology will have come across the Eskimo seal hunters who traditionally practice sexual communism through the winter months, only switch over to patriarchal family life through the summer, returning suddenly to the communism on a particular day announced publicly as an onset of winter. G&W applied this pendulum or oscillation model to the Ice Age cultures of the European Upper Paleolithic, arguing that these complex hunter-gatherers deliberately set up vertical hierarchies of elite privilege and power, only to enjoy the pleasure of tearing them down as the old season gave way to the new. Because they enjoyed this revolution so much, these Ice Age political geniuses realized that they shouldn't hold on permanently to their revolutionary gains. They understood in order to keep enjoying successive revolutions, they would have to fill the intervals with transient counter-revolutions, doing this by allowing special individuals to establish dominance so as to present a nice target for the next revolutionary upsurge. You know, this is the guy who told you that the occupation of the square was a revolutionary result itself. Just remember that, because it shows up here too. Oh my God, has Graeber done damage to radical thought? He's done damage to the Marxist tradition, even though he's not part of it. He's done damage to the anarchist tradition. And while I do miss him, the late David Graeber was an interesting guy to know. Right? I never met him in person. I did argue with him quite a bit, and his arguments always sharpened my thought. I am amazed at how much we let slide from that man. I love this idea, as it happens and uncannily resembles the oscillatory principle that we are in the radical anthropology group have analyzed as an inner secret of hunter-gatherer egalitarianism ever since Blood Relations was published 3 decades ago, 1991. On the other hand, my oscillation model was not quite the same, because we evolved not in subarctic conditions but in Africa. There were good ecological reasons why monthly periodicities should take precedence over seasonal rhythms. So if the power was seized and surrendered in the way that G&W imagined, then social life would have been turned upside down on a monthly schedule, oscillating with the waxing and waning moon. And again, this is because G&W don't look at environmental inputs all that well, as was pointed out by Daniel in What is Politics when the book came out. A pendulum of power. G&W's history is bursting with oppositions and alterations among hunter-gatherers, but its periodicities are one-sidedly seasonal. Don't they know that hunter-gatherers follow not just the sun, but the moon? Their most important rituals, bound up as these are with women's menstrual ebbs and flows, are scheduled by the moon. In the rainforest of the Congo, writes Morna Finnegan, 2008, 2009, 2012, women deliberately encourage men to display their courage and potential for dominance, only to defy them in an all-female ritual known as the Nyoku, before yielding playfully in a pendulum of power between the sexes. G&W allude to this, but then claim that, quote, there is no single pattern. The only consistent phenomenon is the fact of alteration and the consequent awareness of different social possibilities. What all this confirms is that searching for the origins of social inequity really is asking the wrong question. If human beings, through most of our history, have moved back and forth fluidly between different social arrangements, assembling and disassembling hierarchies on a regular basis. Maybe the real question should be how we got stuck. The final question is a truly profound one. It can only be answered, however, once we develop some realistic notion of the situation that previously prevailed. Was there ever a time when our prehistoric ancestors were truly free, truly unstuck, when marriage became permanent? Among the Central African Bayaka forest people, the moon is said to be the woman's biggest husband. Lewis, 2008. From the standpoint of any man, his wife in effect abandons him for her celestial husband each time she bleeds. The reality behind this ancient metaphor, Knight and Lewis, 2017, is a tradition in which women playfully seize power for some part of the month before willingly handing it over to men once they have made their point, establishing what Finnegan, 2008, has termed communism in motion. Patterns of kinship and resonance in such societies set up a pendulum swinging between menstruation and ovulation, brothers and lovers, kinship and marriage, communal solidarity, and the intimacies of sex. Given the probable antiquity of such patterns, G&W are right to view some kind of block on the political oscillation as something which really did happen during the course of history. But accounting for the blockage will require us to deal with a topic that G&W will not touch. It will mean respectfully approaching indigenous people's practices around menstruation. Tessert, 1985, 86, Knight, 1981, Lewis, 2008, Power, 2017. It is also important to understand the variability in kinship patterns and post-marital resonance. Again, a critically important topic that G&D scarcely mentioned in the book. Amongst non-storage hunter-gatherers, women generally insist on living with their own mother, at least until after she has had a couple of children. Marlowe, 2004. Genetic studies have shown that in Africa, where our species evolved, this pattern extends far back into the past. Distro Beazle et al., 2004. Vindu et al., 2013. Wood et al., 2005. In place of lifelong marriage, bride service typically prevails, each African hunter-gatherer woman accepting her chosen lover while continuing to live in her mother's camp. Her temporary husband must make himself useful by bringing back hunted meat to his bride and her household. If he doesn't measure up, he is out. Under such arrangements, everyone alternates between kinship and marital life, in that sense, switching between utterly distinct worlds. Living with mom is a resilient pattern, but pressure from husbands can compel her to switch residence and live permanently with him and his kin. Where this happens, a young woman with her children may find it difficult to escape. As she loses her former freedom, her husband's care for her may then morph seamlessly into a coercive control. It is this disastrous outcome which Engels, as in Friedrich, 1972-1884, described eloquently as the world historic defeat of the female sex. Across most of the world, the patriarchal forces that transform marriage into a fixed bond corresponding impose fixity on the social life as a whole. Yeah, and by the way, guys, for those of you who don't realize this is my doubt on Christopher Lash's view on marriage, but we'll come back here. Now that I think we can totally abolish family or kinship ties, I think particularly through like state rearing of children, I think it's a particularly bad idea. All right, how humanity got stuck. This looks like a promising answer to the question how we got stuck. So, what answer do G&A give to this question? Their final chapter is so meandering that it's difficult to know. They mention how care for a person might more seamlessly into coercive control, but for some reason don't connect this with the changes in the post-marital residence or family life. Yeah, when the man lives with the woman's family, the man is much less likely to abuse the woman. The nearest they get is when describing a spectacle of execution and torture in the 17th century Europe and among the North American Wendat. When we are reminded that the king's right to punish the subject was modeled on the patriarchal duty to discipline his wife and children, yes, it was. It was a paterfamilias as the basis of the imperator. The political domination was publicly represented as the duty of care. By contrast, when the Wendat subjected a prisoner to prolonged torture, it was to make the opposite point. publicly disintegrating dominance and control from loving care. Since the prisoner was not part of the household, he was needed to be tortured, not loved. And so it is that G&W find in this distinction between care and domination their long-awaited explication of how we got stuck. Quote, it seems to us that this connection, or better perhaps confusion, between care and domination is utterly critical to the larger question of how we lost the ability to freely recreate ourselves by recreating our relations with one another. It is critical, that is, to understand how we got stuck. Instead of exploring how hunter-gatherer research and gender studies in G&W confine their horizons to the experience of the first American military leaders, torturers, and European monarchs, exploring how we got stuck by imagining these people's psychological conflicts. If the bewildering words quoted above mean anything, they seem to suggest that we got stuck because certain power-hungry figures confuse caring for people with violently dominating them. Is this a serious explanation? Did people really get confused in this way? In place of an answer, the G&W themselves seem to have gotten stuck. We are offered the same question in slightly different words. Does the newly established nexus between external violence and internal care, between the most impersonal and the most intimate of human relations, mark the point where everything begins to get confused? Is this an example of how relations that were once flexible and negotiable ended up getting fixed in place? An example, in other words, of how we effectively got stuck? No further effort is made to answer the most crucial question of the entire book. Morgan and Ingalls. What is missing here is any real understanding of human revolution. In Chapter 3, G&W criticize what they describe as a mainstream anthropological consensus for likening our forager ancestors to extant hunter-gatherers, simple folk living in tiny mobile hands, in tiny mobile bands. In Chapter 4, they change their mind. The mainstream anthropological consensus, they now tell us, is that hunter-gatherers, such as the original Aboriginal Australians, quote, could travel halfway across the continent, moving among people who spoke entirely different languages, and still find camps divided into some kind of totemic moieties that existed at home. When this means is that half the residents owned them hospitality, but had to be treated as brothers and sisters, so sexual relations were strictly prohibited, while the other half were potential enemies and marriage partners. It was Henry Louis Morgan, not an unproblematic figure, I may add, 1877, 1881, who founded our discipline on the basis of his discovery of so-called classificatory kinship. Its principle can be summed up as the equivalence of siblings. Two brothers, for example, will step into one's shoes with respect to their relationship. And you see this in Levirate marriage. And woman will say to her sister, your children are mine and mine are yours. So there's no concept of private property with respect to children. Family life is not nuclear. Yeah, duh. Sorry, Christopher Lash. Every child will be free to move between her numerous different mothers and other supportive kin, and she will continue to enjoy such freedom throughout her adult life. When life is structured in this way, the result is extraordinary. Everyone can expect hospitality from brothers and sisters, treated formally as an equivalent as to one another in chains of connection stretching across vast areas. One consequence of this is that the state has no soil in which to grow. When people are self-organized, aligned to one another, and where the joys of childcare, sex, dance, and domestic life are more commonly experienced, then there are no dead spaces, no social vacuums for the state to enter and fill. You can't abolish the state without replacing it, and a communal life in today's world, self-organizing neighborhoods and other wider communities is one way of doing this. That's a little optimistic, Dr. Knight. Curiously, Graeber and Wengrow say almost nothing about kinship in their book. Instead of critiquing the Morgan Ingalls paradigm, Graeber and Wengrow turn Ingalls' vision and the origin of the family, private property, and the state upside down. In the beginning, they say, was private property, religion, and the state. To quote the concluding words of Chapter 4, if private property has an origin, it is as own as the idea of the sacred, which is likely as old as humanity itself. Vomit! An earlier book with Marshall Solins on kings, Graeber even suggested, the Graeber part of that book's the dumber part, that since imagined supernatural agents such as divine kings and forest spirits have always exercised authority over people, the principle of state is an immovable feature of the human condition. Vomit again. It may seem paradoxical for an anarchist to accept the inevitability of private property in the state, but the dawn of everything adds weight to the measure. Since, says the authors, anarchist freedom can be implemented, but only in precious moments or enclaves. Hence, why David was obsessed with momentary bullshit like Occupy, and also was not particularly interested in learning about anarchist history, which he admits. People get mad at me when I say it, but he's admitted it. Personally, I find it hard to imagine what kind of enclave might be found in a planet already beginning to burn up. Graeber and Wengrow seem to have abandoned the revolutionary slogan, "Another world is possible." Instead, they offer only the sobering message that hierarchy and equality tend to emerge together as the complements to one another. They seem to be saying that we cannot have freedom in one place without accepting oppression somewhere else. Where do we go from here? Despite these criticisms, the one important point about the book is the advocacy of oscillation. All things living have a pulse. They live and they die. They wake and they sleep. They breathe in and out in ways driven by changing seasons and many other periodicities of our life-friendly Earth, Sun, Moon orbital system. We need to get planet Earth turning once more, not just physically, but also socially and politically too. This will not be done by telling people to stop confusing care with dominance and control. It will be done by supporting the school strikes, singing on the picket lines, extending action to the workplaces, dancing in the streets, blocking traffic, bringing capitalism to a complete halt, and other stuff. Some of the other stuff is kind of ugly. But once we have taken that control, what next? If we stay on strike too long, we'll soon starve. So let's oscillate. Those weekly school strikes, for example, could perhaps be lengthened, joined up, stage once a month, spreading across the world until the release of all humanity from wage labor. Okay, that's really optimistic, Dr. Knight. Carbon emissions immediately cut by 50%. Then we go back to work, reorganize it as necessary. We can risk returning to work only once we're sure that it won't lead back to capitalism. And we can be sure of that only once we've sworn to be back with our children on the picket line next moon. We keep doing this, seizing power and surrendering it until the world is rocking and breathing once more, reclaiming the future, neither patriarchy nor matriarchy, but something like rule by the moon. Okay, this is fun, but I just don't believe social change is that easy. That would be to repeat the class and gender dynamics of the original human revolution. That probably is true. But this time on a higher plane, that's what makes it much harder. The scales of complexity really do make it harder. And I don't mean to imply that, quote, primitive societies are not complex in some sense, but they aren't complex in a way. Anyway, might any of this be possible or practical? Let's open up debate to anyone and see what we can do. That is surely what activist anthropologist David Graeber would have wanted. Graeber has always started from very good premises that humans are neither just cooperative or just competitive. And in fact, the line between cooperative and competitive is actually very thin. But it isn't just that we somehow in our 17th century confuse dominance and care, even though there is a way in which care can turn to dominance, as Claude Lévi-Strauss often said, gifts make slaves. To be in someone's debt, and I don't mean this in like the neoliberal sense of this, and people are like, oh, you say debt means neoliberalism. That's silly. That's a far older concept than that. It's far older than capitalism. But to be in someone's debt is to also be willing to be in a relation of power asymmetry because you trust them. Anyway, while the last little bit there seems a little wild for my taking and a little bit utopian, although a good bit of utopianism would do us maybe a little bit of good these days. Even the radicals are practical right now, and by practical, I mean really operating off of revenge fantasies that they can't do anything about, or pretending that they have power that they don't. Knowledge isn't power, power is power. Nonetheless, it is good to think about how we got here and what most of human history was like, which is why I think anthropology is so important. More teleological minded people will ignore this and kind of begin that everything began when Hegel solved philosophy or some other fairly meaningless notion that people tell themselves to go to bed at night. Bracketing out the great majority of human history. And no, we can't go backwards like that. It's not that simple. But Graeber and Wengrow, they sell people an egalitarian vision while also undercutting most of the research that would have made it understandable. They kind of deny that we are biological species in some ways because biological species are limited by our genetic development. I guess no one wants to be called a social Darwinist. That's an insult to most biology, though. Anyway, on that note, we're going to end this. Hopefully, I get Dr. Knight on the show sometime. Like and subscribe. You can find more behind the Patreon. You can get access for as little as $3 a month. I also sell collections of episodes for small amounts of money, depending on how many you're getting. And I hope you have a great time. Protect your peace.